Okay, so now let's start with gymnosperms. And again, we're on the very last page of the packet. Okay, so what are some major characteristics? So try to write small. There's a lot that goes into it. So, of course, it's multicellular. It does oogamy. It's diploid dominant. What else? What are some advancements? This is the first time you have seeds. So this is a huge advantage. And this is the first time you have heterospores. Right? Earlier we talked about heterospore. What does that mean? You have two different types of spores producing two different types of gametophytes, right? This eliminates the need of swimming sperm, right? From now on you have no swimming sperm. What are some advantages of having a seed? You can actually protect your embryo, right? Your growing embryo. Also, it allows for wider dispersal, right? Now you don't have to now you can actually use the wind to pollinate, not pollinate, sorry, you can use the wind to spread your seeds, right? So it allows you to conquer a larger area of land, right? And because you have heterospore, you can conquer drier areas because your sperm no longer need moisture, right, to fertilize, okay? So these are the two major advantages, and this is the first time you have these two, right? Remember that. Okay, so gymnosperms, of course, are your first seed plants. So gymnosperms aren't very different from ferns, right? What are the only differences? How are gymnosperms different from ferns? They differ in the way they reproduce, right? They differ in the way they reproduce because they do heterospore and they use seeds, right? They use heterospore and they use seeds. So this gets a little bit complicated. So let's start. What's an example of a gymnosperm? Pine tree, right? So pine tree. Okay. So let's start with the male part. Okay. So the pine tree, right, is the sporophyte. Okay. And the pine tree will produce male and female cones, right? So you have a male cone, and you also produce female cones. Okay, so let's start off by looking at what happens in the male cone. So what do you start off with? Okay, so again, this is heterospore. What does that mean? You have two different types of spores, right? In the male cone, you have a microspore mother cell, diploid or haploid. It's actually diploid. Undergoes meiosis to produce the microspore, right? Okay. What happens next? The microspore produces. So the microspore is haploid and actually contains 4 cells. Okay. And then the microspore produces the microgametophyte. Which is also haploid. Okay. So, and the microgametophyte will develop into the pollen grain, right? Pollen grain. So, real quick, let's draw a pollen grain. And it's going to look something like this. often it has wings, right? Wings help with wind dispersal. And you're going to have 4 cells in here. 2 of the cells are really important. This last cell here is known as the tube cell. The tube cell. And one of the cells is known as the generative cell. The generative cell. So you have a tube cell and a generative cell within your male pollen grain. Okay? Are you with me so far? So this is all happening in the male cone. In the female cone, so the female cone looks like this. So you have a scale, and then within the scale you have an ovule. So this is the ovule. And over here you have something known as the micropyle. And the micropyle is essentially a droplet of water that is on the tip, right, of this scale. Okay, are y'all so far? So it's a droplet of fluid, right, on the edge of the scale. So what happens? The pollen grain, right, will fly. So the pollen grain will fly until it attaches to the micropyle, right? The pollen grain attaches to the micropyle. And that liquid, the fluid at the micropyle will evaporate, and as it evaporates, it pulls the pollen grain closer and closer to the ovule, okay? And once the pollen grain is next to the ovule, that is known as what? Pollination. So pollination is when the pollen grain is deposited onto, or deposited next to the ovule. So that's different than fertilization, right? So this can occur a whole year before fertilization. So if this occurs in the spring, fertilization might not occur until the next spring, right? So fertilization and pollination are 2 different processes. Okay, what happens next? So again, so now let's continue this process. Okay. So now let's look at the actual ovule. Okay. So the pollen grain is right now, it's right next to the ovule. Eventually, you want the sperm inside the pollen grain to meet the egg, right? So here is the ovule. Okay. And right now, you have something, it's made up of the nucleus, which is diploid. Okay? And here is your pollen grain. Okay? Bear with me so far. So you have the ovule, and you have the pollen grain that's next to the ovule, right? And earlier we talked about the structure of a pollen grain. What are the 2 major cells inside of a pollen grain? The tube cell and the generative cell, okay? So, now, okay, so on the female side, so earlier we talked about the male side, right? The microspore mother cell. Now let's talk about what happens on the female side, okay? So on the female side, you also have, you have a megaspore mother cell. That is diploid. And that will undergo meiosis to produce megaspores. How many megaspores are produced? 4. Do all of them survive? No. 3 die, 1 survives. Okay? The one that survives becomes the female gametophyte. Okay? So eventually, the female gametophyte will replace the nucleolus. Okay, so the female gametophyte replaces the nucleolus. Right, so all the female gametophyte cells are duplicating. So eventually, this ovule will completely be made of female gametophyte instead of the nucleolus. Okay. So from here to here, now the ovule will be made up of female gametophyte. Okay? So the gametophyte replaces the nucleolus. The female gametophyte is haploid. Okay. So what's happening in the pollen grain? The pollen grain has the tube cell and the generative cell, right? The tube cell elongates, okay? Elongates, and eventually it wants to reach the egg, right? So again, I'm going to draw it here. The tube cell elongates, okay, and creates a pollen tube. Okay, so that's the pollen tube. What does the generative cell do in the pollen grain? So the generative cell produces 2 sperm. Okay? One lives, one dies. Okay, so again, the pollen tube is extending towards the egg, and the generative cell produces 2 sperm, one that dies, one that lives. Right? So here's the sperm that's produced. Okay? And in the ovule, the gametophyte has replaced the nucleolus, right? So now the ovule is completely filled with female gametophyte. The female gametophyte will now produce what? An egg, I'm sorry, an archegonia that produces an egg. So now you have an egg right here, okay? And we know that the sperm of gymnosperms do not swim. So via the pollen tube and via cellular processes, the sperm is brought to the egg. That is fertilization. Sperm means egg. And again, the sperm isn't swimming, it's being carried to the egg via the pollen tube and via cellular processes that push it towards the egg. Okay? So now fertilization occurs, and then that produces the zygote. The zygote is 2N, right? And eventually it's going to develop into the embryo, right? And the zygote would develop into the embryo, and the rest of the ovule develops into the seed, right? The ovule develops into the seed. So now you have something that looks like this. You have your embryo, which is 2N. You have a seed coat that protects the embryo. And what's the middle part made up of? Female gametophyte. Haploid or diploid? Haploid. Okay? So the female gametophyte. What does the female gametophyte provide? Resources. Resources, okay? Okay, so a lot went on, right, in gymnosperms. Right, so what are the big take-home messages? Gymnosperms versus sperms. You have heterospermy, and you have seeds, right? So reproduction is different. You no longer have swimming sperm, right? So can you walk me through the process? So think about it, it's not that bad if you think about it, right? So starting in the male cone, you have a microspore mother cell that's diploid, undergoes meiosis to produce microspores. The microspore produces a microgametophyte. The microgametophyte produces a pollen grain. Inside the pollen grain, you have 4 cells. One of the cells is the tube cell. Another one is the generative cell. Okay, on the female cone, you have a scale that contains 2 ovules, and then that scale has a micropyle, right? The pollen grain will fly into the micropyle. The micropyle, that fluid, will get sucked in until the pollen grain is deposited next to the ovule. That is pollination, okay? Once pollination occurs, while that's happening, inside the ovule, you have a microspore, a megaspore mother cell that's diploid, undergoes meiosis to produce megaspores. The megaspore will produce the megametophyte, and then, yes, the female gametophyte will replace the nucleolus of the ovule, okay? And then the gametophyte will eventually produce an archegonia that produces an egg, okay? So that occurs, and now the pollen grain is next to the ovule. The tube cell inside the pollen grain will elongate. The generative cell will produce 2 sperm. One of the sperm dies, the other one lives, right? The sperm don't swim, so via cellular processes, that sperm is brought to the egg. Fertilization occurs. You produce a zygote. The zygote is diploid. The zygote develops into the embryo. What does the ovule develop into? The seed, right? So within a seed, you have a seed coat, a diploid embryo, and the female gametophyte that's haploid, and that female gametophyte is what provides the resource, right? That's what happens in a gymnosperm. Okay, any questions? Okay. Okay, let's finish off with angiosperms.